So I'll start you with an easy question. How do you feel about your family? Bigger than that, how do you feel about your family history? So that's kind of a loaded question. I haven't even had 2 cups of coffee yet, Kyle. The reason I ask that is because what we're going to see today is super dysfunction. Super dysfunction, terrible decisions, treachery, deceit, and a lot of other bad things. And so when I ask you to think about your own family, like what do you have there? Is there trauma? Is there deceit? Is there lying? Is there addiction? Is there abuse and embarrassment? Is there anything back there that you feel the weight of? And so this message today is very personal for me because when I look to my family history, there's a lot of trauma. My story started really early with trauma, and it happened in connection with my family. So I grew up, and I've shared parts of my story before, but I grew up in a home wrecked by addiction. I was sexually abused by a step cousin or some such. She was related to us somehow through marriage when I was about 7. So again, major trauma, messed this little guy up for years and years and years, and even recently realizing and knowing myself well enough now to be like, man, there's some stuff in my life that I hate about myself, and I think it's time to get counseling. And it's connected to a lot of the family trauma that I have. And so I just made the decision recently, I got to go talk to somebody. I got to get this stuff out and figure these things out. So then as I went through elementary school, eventually my parents would be divorced because of alcoholism, and there was a lot of trauma there. And then growing up through my teenage years, I myself turned to drugs and alcohol, and by the time I was a freshman in high school, I'd already been arrested a couple times, and I was a mess. I was a train wreck by the time my freshman year came. And then I had my cousin tell me one time, because this was my family, this was what all of us were like, on both sides of my family. It didn't matter really what connections I made or where I looked to, there was just a lot of this everywhere. And so I had this cousin say, Kyle, you got to make it out of here, dude. We have all wrecked our lives, and we are going nowhere, and you got to do better. You are our last hope. And I was like, yikes, Mario. That is a lot of pressure. I'm just a freshman in high school, man. But that moment really did resonate with me, because it's yeah, there's a lot of trauma in my family. There's a lot to maybe not be proud of in all sides of my family. And it's don't get me wrong, I love my family, and God's done a lot of good stuff in my family, but just early on, it was really hard. And then I met Jesus in high school, and Jesus told me that because of what he did on the cross, I got to be part of his family. And that was really cool. And then I began to learn Scripture a little bit more, and I began to see these really traumatic and dysfunctional families in the Bible, because there's a lot of mixed and blended families. There's a lot of traumatic things happening within family context. And so what I see here is something that's very personal to me, because in Genesis 19, today where we are especially, is one of those stories where you're going to see major dysfunction happen. You're going to see decisions made out of fear that echo for thousands of years. That's the bad thing about some of these bad choices that get made in the Bible, is they last for a couple thousand years, right? And so what we see, though, is Lot and his daughters finding themselves in a position where it's hard to trust God, or maybe they don't at all, maybe his daughters don't at all, and more specifically, you're going to see them make a decision that's just horrendous. Because they're in the aftermath of Sodom and Gomorrah and everything that's happened there. And I've said several times during this series, because I want to make it clear, just because you see somebody in the Bible, just because you hear a story in the Bible, it does not mean you're supposed to emulate it. It does not mean that you're supposed to emulate them, right? This, just in case you don't pick it up by the end of today, this is not a story that you want to emulate in your life at all. This is something to learn from. And that's what we see a lot of in Scripture, is a lot of broken people that God is teaching us something through, right? And that's absolutely one of these cases today. So, amid the choices that they're going to make, and amid the choices even I see in my own past, there's this profound truth that I want to share, a couple of them actually this morning. The first one is that even in brokenness and dysfunction, God's redemptive power can offer hope and renewal instead of despair. Even in brokenness and dysfunction, God's redemptive power can offer hope and renewal instead of despair. Our family lines, our family history, what we come from, who we come from, is a big part of, an important part of who we are. But that's not, like Lydia prayed, that's not all we are. So here's the second one. With God, because I talk to people that feel like this one, especially sometimes. With God, we're not victims of our family history. He can bring good out of the most broken situations, out of the absolute most broken situations, one of which we're just going to read about today. So where we get that in Scripture, an idea that's pretty popular if you're familiar with this verse, this is what the Apostle Paul says. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God. Good doesn't always feel good. Good is generally going to make us more like Jesus if we allow it, right? Like that's the good that it's talking about, is making us more like him, helping us understand his will, even in the bad. Because he says, for those that love God and who are called according to his purpose. So we're in part 4 of Genesis, and this is a tough section. There's a lot of really heavy things. And the question that I posed during this part of Genesis is, do I trust God with the unknown, right? Can I trust God when things don't make sense? Can I trust God when I don't know what to do next? We see Lot's daughters make a horrendous decision because they don't know what to do with what's next. They don't know where to turn. They don't know how to get out of the situation they find themselves in. And so if you stick with me this morning, you're going to see what I mean. You're going to see the truth of these things, of the power of God being able to redeem your story, your family history, and also show you through the unknown, right? So the setting for today is from last Sunday. So if you weren't here, you don't remember, last Sunday was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a terrible situation, right? It's God's judgment unleashed on this city. And then, though, out of that, you see that Lot and his family have a real difficult time leaving Sodom. They have a hard time letting go of the sin that's in that city. And so what we see on 3 different occasions was this idea right here. This was the idea that came out of last Sunday, that we want to embrace grace and mercy, not sin and judgment. So the city of Sodom refused to listen. Lot's sons-in-law refused to listen, and even Lot's wife refused to listen and let go. And instead of embracing God's grace and mercy, they just chose sin and judgment. And it's like that's the heartbreaking piece, the centerpiece, really, of what happened last week. So that brings us to today. And now they've escaped the city, but they're still living in the shadow of Sodom. They're still absolutely living in the shadow of Sodom. And it's interesting to think about, like, what do our lives look like when we live in the shadow of Sodom? When we, like, try to cheat sin and, we want to kind of get a little bit of it, but not too much of it. And we don't really want to let go of, like, what is normative in our culture, right? The toxicity that's just starting to grow more and more and more in our culture. When we can't really walk away from that and we still live in the shadow of it, what does that do to us? That's a good thing to wrestle with this morning. Like, what does that do to us? So, for today, Genesis 19, 30 through 38, we're going to be looking at God can redeem your family history. God can redeem your family history. But a hint, though, it's going to start with you probably. Sad note for this morning, this is the last we ever hear of Lot in the Bible. This is the last time he ever shows up other than like a reference to his descendants. So his story just kind of bombs out with this event right here. So, verse 30. Lot departed from Zoar and lived in the mountains along with his 2 daughters. So now he's got no wife because he was afraid to live in Zoar. So if you remember from last week, that's a very interesting point because last Sunday we read the very verses where he begged to go to this city. He says, Lord, I don't want to go to the mountains. I can't go up there. I'll die. Let me stay down here in the valley and live in this little town of Zoar because there I can live. And so as a flashback, again, if you don't remember or maybe you weren't here, here's this plea just a few verses earlier from Genesis 19, 17 through 20. He says, as soon as the angels got them outside, so it's this miraculous salvation, right? And you have one of them saying, run for your lives. One of the angels says, look, you got to get out of here. He says, don't look back and don't stop anywhere on the plain. Run to the mountains or you will be swept away. But then Lot's response, right? Because he can't let go of Sodom. He says to them, no, my lords, please. Your servant has indeed found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness by saving my life. So here's what I need from you, angels. Here's what Lot says. I can't run to the mountains. The disaster will overtake me, and I will die. I don't trust you. I don't trust God. I want to stay down here in this valley. I know this valley. It may not be good. It may be toxic, but I want to stay here. I mean, that's a human thing for sure. And then in verse 20, he says, look, this town is close enough for me to flee to. It's just a small place. Please, let me run to it. It's only a small place, isn't it? so that I can survive. So there he is, begging to be able to go to this place. Now he's terrified to live there. And so then what does he do? Instead of going back with Abraham, instead of like connecting himself back to the promise and protection of God, instead it says he and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. They lived in a cave. So they run from this place of protection that they were allowed to go to, and he rejects going back with Abraham. He rejects the protection that he has under God's promise. And they run to this mountainside cave and isolate themselves. Because whenever I'm prepping a sermon, I'm asking lots of questions as I go. And I'm always like, this kind of stuff. I'm like, well, why would he do that? Like, why do you think? Why would he do that? He's got this opportunity at blessing and protection, and yet he wants to isolate. And then I began to think about myself. Well, what do I do when I sin or do something stupid? Usually pride will kick in, and then sometimes shame will kick in. I don't want to admit it because you've probably thought this before. What would they think if they knew what I thought? What would people think of me if they knew what was in my past or what was in my head? What would they say of me? And it's a valid question. That's why you got to be careful with who you share with. But shame is probably what pushed him to not go back, right? He knew better. This was somewhere he picked. He wanted it. He was in the center of everything. He was the city gate, man. He was a decision maker in Sodom. And so probably he was just full of shame and didn't want to go back. So instead they run. And I know, and what I see in my own life, the importance of 2 things. When I screw up, when I make a mistake, running to God and running to godly community. Right? Like I, as your pastor, need community just as much as you do. I am not perfect. Like I'm not speaking at you like I've got no problems. I wish I didn't have any problems. That would be sick. But I have all kinds of problems, right? I've got issues and I need to talk with people. I need people in my life. I need God. I need community. And when I run from that, man, that's where I hurt the most. And this is what you see happening here. And it's like Satan just sets them up, why he's got them isolated. So then what happens? Verse 31. Then the firstborn says to the younger, our father is old and there's no man in the land. So here's the problem, right? The issue. There's no one in the land to sleep with us, as is the custom of all the land. Like, well, okay, what's the problem? What's the custom of the land? Well, back then, we're talking 4,000 years ago, remember, these 2 are looking at 0 prospects for a husband and or children, specifically no sons. It's a big deal back then. So they're seeing a real serious problem in front of them. So when they're wrestling with reality and now they're doubting and saying, well, what do we do now? Right? That's a big problem. And then because of this question right here, this fear right here, things are now going to get weird and gross and sinful. And when I knew that this was going to be what I was preaching about, because I wanted to squeeze this Sunday into last Sunday and just go like a side note, just kind of breeze over this message really quickly, because this is gross and weird and uncomfortable. And so this is what this idea turns into. She says, come, let's get our father to drink wine so that we may sleep with him and preserve our father's line. It's like, yeah, you're reading that correctly. This is their plan. This is what they want to do. And the NLT, so this is the CSB I usually preach out of, but the NLT is a little bit more of, it's kind of idea for idea rather than word for word. But it's actually almost more direct. It says, come, same verse, come, let's get him drunk with wine, and then we will have sex with him. Today, that way, we'll be able to preserve the family line through our father. So this is not one of those stories you're going to find in a children's Bible. And it's not one that you want to emulate in your own life. This is not like, oh, I should do that. This is not one of those settings. Because again, they're living in the shadow of Sodom here. Right? It's like, in a way, it's almost like an honorable idea. We want to preserve our family line, but because of the brokenness that is in these 2 young women, and I think maybe their morality has been normalized to such a low level, it's like when you live in that toxic environment for so long, how long does it take for your morality bar to just basically go to 0? Right? Like what has happened to this family that this would seem like a plan that would be good? And I want you to think about your own life, because again, this is so practical, because I don't think that, maybe you won't go here, but it's like, what do we go to when, like, think about all the media that you consume, right? The movies you consume that you watch regularly, the TV shows that you kind of make excuses for with like all the stuff that's in it, right? The social media you follow, the YouTube you're watching, it's like, there's so many things in our life, and our lives are cumulative. Right? All that little stuff just affects how we think and what we think is right and okay and good, and what we think, more importantly, maybe sometimes even about ourselves. And you have all these little things just taking like little pinpricks, right? And taking shots at you all the time. And it's like, eventually it's like, okay, well, that's not that bad. That's not that bad. And then all of a sudden you're down that road a ways, and it's like getting sick over a long period of time. You don't realize how far you've gone in that sickness until you realize, like, wow, I really feel awful. And then all of a sudden, if you are healed from that, you're like, wow, I didn't realize how bad I felt, right? So this is what we see, I think, happening to these women here, is that they have gotten to such a point that they're just like deadened to what is right and what's wrong, living in this shadow now of Sodom. Because what they're going to do right here, this plan is going to completely destroy the memory and the honor and the integrity of this guy Lot. Like this wrecks his whole being. I mean, this, like, culturally, this is awful, right? But there's this underlying tension as well. So they get him drunk, right? The problems of being overly drunk, like trouble that can get you into. Because think of this as well. There's two things that happen. Two guys. We just read about one not long ago, Noah and the flood, right? Major destruction, major judgment there. And then this guy right here, Lot. After both of these big events, what do? They both get blind drunk. And I really wondered, like, why would they do that? They get blind drunk. Both of them get embarrassed by their kids, and it involves weird things that happen to both of them. Why would that happen? Why did they go there and get that intoxicated right after they got to see something so up close and personal? It's like, was it the trauma of the event? Like, what was happening, right? What was exactly going on in these people? So then verse 33, so they got their father to drink wine that night. The firstborn came and sleeps with her father. He did not know when she got up or when she lay down. So it's like, this little note there is like a caveat. Like, Lot's not a great guy. He's done some bad stuff, but at least he's separated from this act. But it's like, gosh, how could he get that bad? Then the next day, the firstborn says to the younger, look, I slept with dad last night. Let's get him drunk again so you can go and sleep with him and we can preserve our family line. That night, they again got their father to drink wine, and the younger went and slept with him. And he did not know when she lay down or when she got up. It's like, gosh. So, like, just to be clear again, so just recently, he offered his daughters up. If you weren't here last Sunday, he does this in a sense to his daughters. He offers them up to be exploited by the men of the town. Horrible decision to protect two guests that are in his home. So he offers them up to be exploited. Now here he is, not long after, being exploited by these very same young women. And it's like just the toxicity of living there in Sodom and what that's done, how it's just blown this family up. This is such a screwed up story and such a screwed up family. And again, I was like, maybe I can just make a small reference to it. I did not want to preach about this little event here. I was like, oh, man. But it's like, it's important because there's a lot of draw out of it because the Bible doesn't hide a lot of stuff, right? It's just like a lot of the times it just lays the story out and it's like, here's what happened. Here's the reality of it. Warts and all, messiness and all. Here's what's in here, right? And it's like, well, what can we learn from this? So here's what happens after this. Both of Lot's daughters, they become pregnant by their father. It's like, the firstborn gave birth to a son named Moab, and he is the father of the Moabites today. And the younger also gave birth to a son, and she named him Ben-Ami, and he's the father of the Ammonites today. So it's like this important little, like it's kind of odd. It seems like, well, so what? But this is an explanation of a lot of tension that would come in the future for the nation of Israel. These people come up again and again. The Moabites and the Ammonites, they come up again and again and again. But their story, the important thing to remember about their story is how it begins. Like, this is a really embarrassing and shameful start to entire people groups, right? So let's start with Moab. So Moab means from father. Two Hebrew words, Min and Ab. Ab is a shortened form of Abba, which means father, so Moabites. Now, the awkward thing about this is I wondered, so here they are, they're up in this cave, no other guys around, it's just like, dad and daughters, and she names one of her kids from my father. Like, did Lot never question that? Like, that's an interesting name. Where'd that come from? From my father. What do you mean by that? It's like, there's messiness and ugliness and awkwardness and grossness, like all tied up into this story, but this is how they start. So when you think about your own family history and the problems that they have, think about how this family started and about what their cultural heritage was. Because literally, for thousands of years, the people of Israel remember the beginnings of this people group. So to say you were a Moabite, like, oh, you're one of those people, huh? Gene pool's kind of shallow over there on your side, isn't it? Right? It's like, that would have been shameful. Then you have the second one, Ben Ami. That means son of my people. Ben, you see that a lot in Hebrew. Ben, son of, and derivation of my people. So Ammonites, right? These two people groups are marked by this event. Now, as time goes on, though, with these two groups, you see that they are very much connected to their people. Now, who is their people? Well, it's certainly not the people of Abraham. These two young girls, they grew up in Sodom. That was their people. That's what they knew. This is the culture that they were part of. And these two groups are unfortunately going to be marked by their connection to this stuff. And again, it's like, what do we do with that? How do we see our own past and the people that are behind us, right? And then how does that affect the ones that come after us? Son of my people. And sadly, what you have happening up in this cave in the middle of nowhere is you have the rebirth of Sodom in this cave. They had an opportunity to get away. But you have the rebirth of this terrible city in this awkward and disgusting scenario here in Sodom, just outside of Sodom. So what do we do with all that? So let's take back like a big picture look. Let's step back and think about this. So what's happened so far? Why is this all important? Well, both Abraham and Lot now, big picture, like family fallout, they both have kids that are going to be enemies to the promise that God made to Abraham. So Lot has Ishmael, who's always going to be at war with the other descendants of Abraham. They still are today, right? The descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Abraham essentially are those that follow Islam and those that follow Judaism. So you look to the Middle East and you're like, man, what's going on in the Middle East? It's like these problems began, and God prophesied way, way back then, 4,000 years ago. He said they would always be at each other's throats. That's crazy. 4,000 years later, and it's still true. And now Lot's got two of his own that are going to be the Ammonites and the Moabites that are always going to be a thorn in the side for the nation of Israel, all the way up to the time of Jesus. It's going to be an issue. So it's like, and here's what I don't want you to miss today in 2024. It's like the very people that are a part of the promise that God has given are actively working to destroy the promise. For us today, what does that look like for you? If here's what Jesus says, because of this is what Jesus says in John 10:10. I have come to give you an abundant life. Like, I've come to give you an abundant life. Because the thief, he's going to want to steal, kill, and destroy. But me, I'm giving you something different, both here in this life and in the next. So if now, like Brittany said, if I get to be a child of God, if that's now my identity, what am I doing? What are you doing to actively work against that? And maybe even in some ways completely dismantle that beautiful promise that we have that we get to be children of God. With the decisions you make, right? With the lack of time that you spend with him. All these little things that accumulate in our life, and then we wonder why, like, I don't know why I'm just not close to God at all. Right? And I do that too, right? Like, I don't spend time with him, and I let my life take over, and it's like all of a sudden I don't feel close to him, and it's like, well, what have I been doing? Well, I've kind of been working against the promise. Right? I have been, just like these two did. Just like these two did. Because God made a promise, though, that would ultimately lead to Jesus, and it was like he was going to do everything he could to protect that, even though these people were working against it. So I see God's justice, his mercy, his grace in there. And so by the time 2,000 years later goes by and it gets to the time of Jesus and the New Testament church, like, how do they look back on this event? Like, how do they summarize the dangers of Sodom and Gomorrah? Like, what does Jesus say about this event and these people? Well, as far as like culture goes, a Christian perspective in the New Testament is one of like being wise, being aware of the culture that we live in. Because here's one of Jesus' best friends, John, being wise about the culture. This is what John says in 1 John chapter 2. He says, do not love the world or anything in the world, for the world and its desires pass away. And then it goes on. It's like under the judgment of God. It's like, and then, but there's also a really practical part of this. So when I was a student pastor and even a teacher, I tried to help students and teenagers understand that everything in your life right now seems like the most important thing ever. Ever. But it's not. And you seem like callous, like you don't understand. And it's like, I do. Because that bubble's going to burst and you're going to graduate high school, and 98% of the people that you really were all worried about and the issues you were all concerned about are not going to matter at all anymore. Like, literally, you're going to walk across the stage and you're going to go out into the parking lot and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, none of this even matters. Like, I'm never going to see any of these people again. And you can already feel it. I remember when I graduated, just feeling that, like, I'm never going to see any of these people again. It's like, wow, right? And so, but that bubble is all encompassing, but it's like, hey, take that to every stage of your life. All this stuff that you want to chase, because now that you get identified by different things the older you get, right? And so it's like, all that stuff is going to pass away. Like, what are you doing with your life? Who are you following? And then here's how Jesus put it. So are we chasing after culture? Are we chasing after God? Like, which one are we chasing after? So in Luke 17, this is how Jesus addresses that idea about this event. He said, remember Lot's wife. She refused to let go of Sodom, and it cost her life. He says, whoever tries to make his life secure, whoever just wants to rely on themselves and be their own God is going to lose their life. And then he says, in relation to himself, whoever loses his life will preserve it. Whoever's willing to say, Lord, I give you my life. That's what he means. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's what he's calling us to, is like, we can trust in culture and like the system that we're a part of, or we can trust Jesus. And it's like, that's how he looks back on these events. That's how he addresses this stuff. Now, you're probably thinking, though, also, like, okay, you said you were going to talk about God redeeming my family history, but this so far doesn't feel very redeeming at all, Pastor Kyle. Like, we're just talking about how bad it is. And I wanted to do that because I want to set the stage for how weighty the decisions were and the effect that they had and the damage that was caused, and even 2,000 years later, how the New Testament was looking back on these events. But I do want to share some cool details from this cursed family line, because God promised to bless and protect those that were connected to Abraham. Like, in an odd way, not just his line, but those that would bless you, I will bless, he said. So it's like, if you're connected to this people group, I'm going to take care of you. And he does it with these people. So here's what he says in Deuteronomy 2. So I want to like step you through the Bible a little bit, and I want to show you how God redeems this embarrassing family line. So in Deuteronomy 2, now we're about 400 or 500 years later with Moses. And he says to Moses, God says to me, Moses, show no hostility toward Moab, and do not provoke them to battle, because now they're coming through their land. He says, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, since I've given Ar as a possession to the descendants of Lot. Like, you've got to stay away from these people, because I am going to protect this line. Is like, as awkward as they may be, because of their past, it's like, they're still important to me. And then he goes on to address the other group. When you get close to the Ammonites, specifically, God's calling them out. Don't show any hostility to them or provoke them. He says, for I will not give you any of the Ammonites' land as a possession. I have given it as a possession to the descendants of Lot. This is God keeping his promise, like 400 or 500 years later, after a lot of time has passed and a lot of like probably misunderstanding about these people has passed. These people, though, they get themselves in trouble, because God says, look, I'm going to protect all people. I'm going to bless all people that are connected. More importantly, though, it's going to spread out, Abraham, and all people on earth will be blessed through you. And so these awkward family lines, because of their relationship with Abraham and his family line, are going to be blessed and protected. It's like, that right there is so big for me. Like, to know that God is not just going to write you off because of your family. He's not going to write your children off because of you and the mistakes that you make, right? Because a lot of us, even as good parents, we're just hoping that our kids won't have to get too much counseling because of us, right? We're just like, I hope I do a somewhat good job, so they're not too messed up. And it's like, it's so difficult. And it's like, but trusting that God is like, no, I've got this. I'm bigger than your mistakes is like such a powerful thing. So he makes this promise to Abraham, and he says, centuries later, he's going to keep it. And then there's this idea that then after this, then you really get to see what happens to these people. And you get to see this equation of like redeemed over dysfunction. Very dysfunctional beginnings to their story, but this is where it gets cool. So follow me here. So centuries after this event in the book of Genesis, after Lot and everything that's going on with his daughters in this cave, centuries later, this is what happened. The union of Ruth the Moabitess, so she is one of these members, Ruth the Moabitess and Judah's descendant Boaz reconciled the alienated families of Lot and Abraham, because Judah is a descendant of Abraham. So these two lines that go off in these divergent directions, because of Ruth, now all of a sudden they're brought back. And now God is going to use somebody in this very cursed line to do something amazing. Because what happens when these two lines come together? Well, it provides for Israel's greatest king, King David. And you can see that, you can read that story in the book of Ruth. There's like 4 chapters in that book. And it's really powerful because Ruth is an outcast. She's got nobody. She's got no solutions. She's like a widow without children. She's got nothing. And yet all of a sudden God is going to like, no. From this cursed line, I'm going to do something great. But it doesn't end there. So God continues to kind of watch out for these people, and these people still continue to play a bigger part of the role of God bringing redemption to the world through Jesus Christ. So here's what happens next. And this is what my job is as a pastor. Like legit, I want to tie these lines together for you because it's hard to read sometimes thousands of years of human history and be like, and remember a story in Genesis and be like, oh, this is how it picks up at the very end of the Old Testament. So what happens? During the Babylonian exile, about 600 years before Jesus, so at the end of the Old Testament, both the Moabites and the Ammonites provided safe refuge for the Jews who had fled Judah, because Judah was being wiped out. The nation of Judah was done. And you see that in Jeremiah 40. So it's like, again, here they come. They're still a part of the story of God because Jesus Christ would eventually come through this tribe. So his people could not be completely wiped out. So who steps into the gap to protect them? Well, this cursed family line. But most importantly, though, where this all goes is the fact that God used this family line to do this. So he used the Moabites as the line through whom Jesus' earthly and legal father, Joseph, would be born. So this act that we read, this terrible act up in this cave, would have implications all the way down, and here's God redeeming this story all the way down to the time of Jesus. So some people during Christmas will read a couple passages from the New Testament. The Christmas story involves the lineage of Jesus. So a lot of times people will pick Luke chapter 3 to read for, where Jesus came from and his story and all that. And I was just talking the other day with a friend, and he was like, sometimes with the lineages, I don't understand why all the names. I get confused, I get lost, and like this person begat that person, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and it's like, yeah, it's tough. It's tough. But here's one of the cool places where that really comes to bear, and it ties the things together. So if you go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, this is the lead up to Jesus. This is the connections that God is showing us. So way, way back, Salmon fathered Boaz, so now we're in the book of Ruth, by Rahab, which I love because 2 things here. You have 2 women here. Women were never listed in genealogies, ever. Culturally, that just didn't happen. It didn't matter. It was like this son, to this son, that father. That's all it ever was. So the fact that we have these 2 women here is awesome because Rahab was probably a prostitute. And talk about God redeeming your story. Talk about God never letting you be just the sum of your sins. And him just like, that's who Jesus is. That's why this is a part of his lineage. It's like, this is what my mission is. Look at my own family history. And then Boaz would father Obed by Ruth, a Moabite, a part of a shamed culture, a shamed people group that weren't a part of the promise. And it was like, and that's what we knew about them for so long. But look how God has redeemed this family line through the person Jesus, through the Messiah Jesus. So by Ruth, and then Obed, as it goes on, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David, the greatest king of all in Israel, right? He was the warrior king. Solomon had a bigger empire and he did more stuff, but King David is the guy, right? He is the guy. And then from verse 5 there and 6, it goes all the way down to verse 16, and it ends this way. It says Joseph, right? Works all the way down. Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So this is a really big story about God redeeming the worst situation, about you never ever being like a victim of your family history, you never being a victim of past sins of your family. Because I talk to people a lot and they're like, well, this is what I had in my dad and this is what his dad was like. And just talked to a guy last week and he said, well, my grandfather was like this, my dad was like this, and now I'm like this. And I said, but you know what's cool though, man? I said, you have a beautiful and powerful opportunity to be the start of something brand new. You have a unique opportunity to end what you clearly see as a family curse. That's the powerful thing about the Jesus that we follow. He says, I'm a God of redemption and renewal. I bring things that are dead to life. I bring light where it's nothing but darkness. I can redeem and restore anything. And there's people that need to hear that because I talk to people all the time. They feel like they're a victim of the paths and patterns that have been taken by their family. And so I'll end where I began earlier. Even in brokenness and dysfunction, God's redemptive power can offer hope and renewal instead of despair. Even in brokenness and dysfunction, God can do that. And I see it all over the place in families. And the families in America are being ripped apart and destroyed. Right? You talk to people that work with families in schools, social care workers, nurses, doctors, like the destruction and like disruption of the family unit is hard, and it's really doing damage. And so it's like, where do we go with that? Like, what kind of hope can we offer people that have come out of that? And then the second one we started with God, we're not victims of our family history. Right? Our family history is an important part of who we are, but the good news, though, also is that he can bring good out of the most broken situations. That's the hope that I see in just story after story, family after family in Scripture. And then how it just always seems to lead to Jesus in the Bible, and it's like he's doing something new. He's redeeming, he's restoring, he's resurrecting. So I want to read these words together. I want you to read them with me as we close out today, because we started off reading them together, so let's do it again. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Remember, the story's never over as long as God is involved, right? So let me pray. Lord, I thank you so much for how you put these things together. God, how over thousands of years, God, you bring redemption. You restore people that were birthed in shame and awkwardness, and you're just such a good God that you never let go of these people. And not only did you not let go of them, Lord, but you let them be a centerpiece. God, help us to see that. So right now, Lord, whether we're watching, listening, whether we're here, God, would you help us to see the redeeming nature of the creative God, Lord, Yahweh God, Jesus Christ, what you can do with dysfunction and brokenness, Lord. Right now, just want to give you just space, Lord, here to do whatever you need to do in us, or maybe a friend that we need to think of, or a family member, whatever it is, Jesus. Would you show us? Show us how this lands. And I pray, God, you go with us this day and the next and the one after. And I pray that in your name, Jesus Christ. And his church said, amen. It was great seeing you guys.